October 2011, West Side Motor Gallery, Los Angeles. One of the most exclusive luxury car dealerships in California, a gleaming cathedral-like showroom where the cars on display cost more than most people's houses, and the salesman had learned, through long experience, to read a customer's net worth in the first 15 seconds of eye contact. Polished floors, track lighting calibrated to make every car look like it was already moving. Red Ferraris, silver Porsches, midnight black Bentleys catching the light with the quiet authority of things that knew exactly what they were worth. The salesman on the floor had been working there 3 years. He knew the inventory. He knew the financing. He knew, most importantly, how to look at a person who had just walked through the glass doors and calculate, with the efficiency of someone who had done it 10,000 times, whether that person was worth his morning. The man who walked in at 11:15 was tall, silver-haired, dark blazer over a simple open-collar shirt, dark trousers, no tie. Nothing that announced itself. He moved through the entrance with the unhurried ease of someone with no particular schedule and no particular need to impress anyone. The salesman looked at him for 3 seconds, made his assessment, and walked over with the professional smile of a man who had already decided this would be a short conversation. What he did not know, what he could not possibly have known in those 3 seconds, was that the man he had just assessed was Clint Eastwood, and that by the time the sun went down that day, the building he was walking across would no longer belong to the people he thought it belonged to. By 2011, Clint Eastwood was 81 years old. He had directed 36 films, won 4 Academy Awards, been mayor of Carmel, built a production company that had generated more revenue than most people could meaningfully visualize. He owned property across California, including a significant commercial real estate portfolio in Los Angeles. He did not wear these facts. He had never been the kind of man who wore his accomplishments like a uniform, for the benefit of people who needed to know the rank before deciding how to treat the person. He wore dark blazers and open collars and drove himself places. He carried no entourage. He walked into rooms exactly as he was. This had cost him over the years a certain number of first impressions. The salesman reached him near the Ferrari, extended his hand, smiled the smile, and began asking the questions that were not really questions. The conversational architecture of a man deciding how much of his morning this person deserved. Clint answered each one with the unhurried directness of someone who had nothing to perform. He was interested in the Ferrari, the red one. The salesman's smile held. His eyes did something else. It's a beautiful machine, the 458 Italia. He moved toward it with the proprietary ease of a man conducting a tour of his own house. It's also a significant investment, just over $230,000. He let the number do its work. Watched Clint's face for the reaction he expected. Clint looked at the car, looked back. "Tell me about it," he said. The salesman studied him 2 more seconds. The blazer, the shirt, the complete absence of visible markers of the kind of wealth that bought cars at this price. He made a decision he would spend a great deal of time regretting. And the smile that followed was the kind certain salesmen deploy when they have decided to manage a customer rather than serve one. The smile that says, with complete professional deniability, that the conversation is already over. The salesman gave Clint the courtesy tour, the abbreviated version, thorough enough to be professional, brief enough to communicate that a sale was unlikely. He walked Clint around the Ferrari, mentioned engine specifications in the tone of someone who assumes the technical details won't be understood. Noted the waiting list, the exclusivity, the costs of insurance and maintenance. Each piece of information delivered not as education, but as barrier. Clint listened to all of it without interruption. At the end, the salesman arrived at his destination, the pivot towards something more appropriate. Now, we do have some exceptional vehicles in a more accessible range. A pre-owned Porsche Cayenne, for example. "I don't want a Porsche Cayenne," Clint said. "Of course. Perhaps we could discuss your budget." "I want to know about the Ferrari," Clint said. "The red one." A beat. "Sir." The word "sir," in the way he said it, contained something several witnesses would describe as the moment the temperature changed. Not aggressive, simply completely, unmistakably condescending. A car at this price point requires a fairly specific financial situation. I want to make sure we're using your time well. Clint looked at him, and in the silence that followed, the specific, occupied Eastwood silence that anyone who had watched one of his films would have recognized immediately, the salesman felt for the first time the faint possibility that he had made a miscalculation. 8 seconds. The colleague across the floor counted them later. 8 seconds during which Clint Eastwood looked at the salesman with the expression recorded in dozens of films, communicating without a word that whatever had just been said had been heard in its entirety, assessed with complete precision, and found to contain nothing requiring immediate response. Not anger, not embarrassment. The steady, unhurried regard of a man who has been assessed by faster minds than this and found wanting by people who turned out to be wrong. "What's your name?" Clint asked. The salesman told him. "How long have you worked here?" 3 years. The question felt strange, not hostile, unexpected. Clint nodded, looked back at the Ferrari, ran one hand lightly along the edge of the hood, not touching the paint, the careful gesture of someone who understood what cars cost. "It's a beautiful car," he said quietly. He turned back. "I'd like to speak with the manager." The salesman walked across the showroom with the gait of someone who is not certain what is happening, but has begun to suspect the morning is not going where he expected. The manager came out of his office, shook Clint's hand, recognized him in the first second, and his face did something that the salesman, watching from across the floor, would remember for the rest of his career. The manager had been running the West Side Motor Gallery for 6 years. He shook Clint Eastwood's hand and understood, with the complete and immediate recognition of a man who grew up watching Dirty Harry, exactly who was standing in his showroom and what the last 20 minutes had almost certainly involved. "Mr. Eastwood, it's a genuine honor." Clint said he appreciated that, said he'd been looking at the 458, said he had a few questions, not about the car, but about the dealership itself, its ownership structure, whether the principal owners had any interest in discussing the property. The manager went very still. "I've been looking at commercial properties in this area," Clint said, with the same unhurried ease he had brought to the entire morning. "This is a well-located building. Good bones. I'd like to know if it's available." Across the showroom, the salesman was watching. He could not hear the conversation, but he could see the manager's face, the shift from professional warmth to something more complex, the expression of a man processing several things simultaneously. He began slowly to walk toward the conversation. He arrived close enough to hear the last part, and that last part was the part that would follow him out of the building and into every version of the story he subsequently told, because it was not dramatic, not delivered with emphasis, just said in the same tone as everything else that morning, which somehow made it worse. "I'd like to make an offer," Clint said, "on the dealership, the building, the inventory, the operation. The number I have in mind is fair, more than reasonable. I'd like to move on it today." Today. The word landed with the full weight of what it meant. Not someday, not eventually, not subject to financing and approval. Today. The word of a man for whom the question of affordability is not the question and has not been for a very long time. The salesman stood at the edge of the conversation, processing the recalibration that would take days to fully complete, the reconstruction of everything he had assumed about the man in the dark blazer. The manager offered water. Clint sat down with the ease of a man settling in for a conversation he has no urgency about, which somehow communicated more urgency than any display of impatience could have. The manager walked toward his office, past the salesman, said something quiet only the salesman could hear. 3 words. "You know who that is." Not a question, a statement, carrying within it everything that statements of that kind carry. The weight of the error, the dimensions of the miscalculation, the precise gap between what was assumed and what was true. The salesman stood on the showroom floor, looked at the man sitting in the chair with a glass of water and no particular expression, and felt something move through his chest that was not quite any one emotion, but contained elements of several. What happened in the manager's office over the next 45 minutes is consistent across all accounts. Calls were made. The ownership group, a consortium of investors who had acquired the property 4 years earlier, was contacted and advised of the situation. The situation being that Clint Eastwood was sitting in their showroom, drinking water, and wanted to buy the building. The offer was more than reasonable. The offer of a man who understood what things were worth and had decided not to negotiate the worth down, but to pay it, because the value of moving quickly was greater than the value of saving the margin. In the showroom, Clint waited with the complete stillness that was not the absence of activity, but its most concentrated form. The salesman had tried twice to leave the floor. Both times he found himself returning. On the second return, Clint looked at him. Not with anger, not with the satisfaction of a man watching someone understand they were wrong. Just looked at him with the same steady, unhurried regard that had characterized the entire morning. He would think about that look for a long time afterward. The part he always returned to, telling the story at dinner tables and industry events, was not the purchase or the number. It was that look, the complete absence of anything retributive in it, because Clint Eastwood, sitting in a chair in a car dealership he was in the process of buying, was not performing anything. He was simply there. And being simply there, it turned out, was more than enough. At 12:47, the manager emerged from his office. He sat down across from Clint, said the ownership group had accepted. Clint nodded, as though he had expected no other answer. "My team will handle the details," Clint said. He picked up his water glass. "About the Ferrari," the manager blinked. "The 458, I'd still like to buy it. Today, if the paperwork can be arranged." From the manager, the involuntary exhale of a man who has spent 45 minutes managing a situation of extraordinary density and has just been reminded that at the center of it all was a man who came in because he wanted to look at a car. "Absolutely," and the manager said. "Absolutely, Mr. Eastwood." Across the showroom, the salesman understood what had happened. He stood on the floor he had worked for 3 years. The floor that was, he was now understanding, in the process of belonging to someone else, and felt the full dimensions of the morning arrive in his chest all at once, not as humiliation, as something more complicated, the specific, irreversible understanding of a moment when a judgment made in 3 seconds turned out to be the wrong judgment, demonstrated with a completeness that left no room for interpretation. By 2 o'clock, the story had left the building, person to person, with the speed of information that people feel they own because they heard it from someone who was there. By the end of that day, the community of dealers in Los Angeles had heard some version of it. By the end of the week, it had spread further. Clint Eastwood drove the Ferrari home that afternoon. Red, 458 Italia. He drove it the way he drove everything, attentively, without performance, with the genuine pleasure of a man who likes cars and has never needed to explain why. The salesman drove home in his own car, sat with the morning, called someone and described what had happened with the disbelief of someone who knows they are the protagonist of a story that will be told for a long time. In the years that followed, Clint Eastwood continued to do exactly what he had always done. American Sniper in 2014, Sully in 2016, The Mule in 2018, Richard Jewell in 2019. He continued to be, at an age when most men have long since stopped, exactly what he had always been. But there was one more thing, one detail passed along in the accounts of that morning. The part people remembered after they had forgotten the numbers and the timeline and the model of the car. Late that afternoon, the manager apologized, simply directly on behalf of the experience Clint had had earlier. Clint looked at him for a moment. "Don't," he said. "He's good at his job." He read what he saw. A pause. "I just happened to be more than what he saw." "That's not his fault," Clint said. "That's what happens when you read the cover." He picked up the Ferrari keys and turned them once in his hand. The book was always going to be the book. Didn't matter what anyone thought of the cover. He stood, thanked the manager, shook his hand, and walked out through the glass doors of the West Side Motor Gallery, a building that, as of that afternoon, he owned, into the California afternoon, where the red Ferrari was waiting. The salesman left several months after that October morning, found work elsewhere, became in time better at his job, not because the story broke him, but because it taught him, in the specific and irreversible way that only direct experience teaches, The limits of 3-second assessments and the extraordinary variety of what a person can be inside a dark blazer and an open collar. He tells the story still. He tells it on himself, which is the only honest way to tell a story you were wrong in. Because that is the thing about Clint Eastwood that was always true, and that the salesman discovered in the specific, costly, unforgettable way that some truths get discovered. He was never performing anything. Not the ease, not the stillness, not the patience. He was simply himself, completely, consistently in every room he walked into, whether anyone in that room knew who he was or not. And being simply himself had always been enough to buy the building. Some mornings teach you everything. That one was a Tuesday.